Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Isra Hassan with the Osher Center for Integrative Health here at Northwestern University, and in partnership with IFAM, I am pleased to welcome you to the Grand Round series. At the end of the presentation today, there will be time for questions, so please enter all your questions in the chat. Today's guest speaker is Veronica Womack, PhD. Dr. Womack is an educational developer and is currently the Associate Director of Inclusive Learning Communities at Northwestern University Searle Center for Advancing Learning and Teaching. Dr. Womack earned her doctorate in social psychology from Howard University and completed an epidemiology postdoctoral fellowship at Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine. She's also a mindfulness coach, offering consultations and facilitating mindfulness classes for community-based research programs. Dr. Womack also recently co-edited a book volume published by Routledge entitled Beyond White Mindfulness, Critical Perspective on Racism, Wellbeing, and Liberation. The title of today's presentation, as you can see, is Addressing Racial Inequality in Mind-Body Interventions, Notes from Culturally Responsive Facilitators. Welcome, Dr. Womack.
Thank you, Isra, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar, as well as to IFAM and the Osher Center for this invitation. I have certainly benefited from some of the professional development offerings that you all have even expanded beyond the Feinberg School of Medicine, which is why I'm able to take advantage of them. So thank you, and I'm glad to be a part of this growing legacy of speakers and instructors. And I plan for us to have a good time learning together today. And again, focusing on the subject matter today, which is to think about how we can really be intentional about addressing racial inequality in mind-body interventions. And these are, everything I share with you will be informed by some notes that I have received from others who are consider themselves culturally responsive facilitators. And I too consider myself to be a culturally responsive facilitator. So whether you're deeply involved in mindfulness-based interventions, or you know that you instruct individuals, or you're a mentor, I think that there will be some practices that we can take from our talk today and just bring into our everyday interaction. So again, thank you for joining today, and let's go ahead and jump in. So I want to first acknowledge that I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. So during our time together, I will share some insights from my colleagues who contributed chapters to Beyond White Mindfulness, Critical Perspectives on Racism, Wellbeing, and Liberation, a book volume that I co-edited with Doctors Crystal Fleming and Jeffrey Prue. And they are instructors at Brown University and as well as Stony Brook University. And we know that there are so many benefits to mindfulness-based practices, with some of those benefits being, decreased perceptions of stress, anxiety symptoms, depressive symptoms, as well as an increase in sleep quality. And I'm really excited to share some of the culturally responsive considerations that we can make to these interventions, and making these interventions more inclusive and subsequently more effective. And just to make sure we're on the same page when I talk about mind-body interventions or even mindfulness, it has been defined as being meaning that you're paying attention, but in a particular way. You're paying attention to your present moment experiences, but you're doing this in such a way that you're not being judgmental about what you're experiencing internally or externally, but you're just noticing what is happening, what that present moment experience is. And by doing that, it's proposed that you're better able to make your next decisions in a way that's more responsive than reactive. So to put mindfulness, just kind of briefly, what that may look like and feel like. So if you don't mind, I would love if we could begin with just grounding us in a Native American Uti prayer, which is featured in Jeffrey Prue's chapter entitled Exploring the Adaptation of Mindfulness Interventions to Address Stress and Health in Native American Communities. This prayer reinforces many of the attitudinal foundations of mindfulness, which are acceptance, beginner's mind, letting go, non-judging, non-striving, patience, and trust. And this is a bit of the reading. Earth, teach me quiet as the grasses are still with new light. Earth, teach me suffering as old stones suffer with memory. Earth, teach me humility as blossoms are humble with beginning. Earth, teach me caring as mothers nurture their young. Earth, teach me courage as the tree that stands alone. Earth, teach me limitation as the ant that crawls on the ground. Earth, teach me freedom as the eagle that soars in the sky. Earth, teach me acceptance as the leaves that die each fall. Earth, teach me renewal as the seed that rises in the spring. Earth, teach me to forget myself as melted snow forgets its life. Earth, teach me to remember kindness as dry fields weep with rain. If you could take a moment to see what you're noticing right now. Thank you. So now let's take some time to just discuss racial inequality. So we want to think about racial inequality, how it shows up in, in a way where we want to bring awareness to the connection between one's mind and one's body. So that seems like a pretty personal piece. Okay, we're just talking about the mind-body connection. Where would any racial inequality fall in that relationship? Or in a setting that's intended to help nurture or cultivate that relationship? Well, for me, it shows up as the implicit suggestion of what is permissible to think, to feel, or to say in such settings where we're learning about mind-body interventions. It shows up in the subtle articulation of, that's not what this space is for. And if what you're thinking is expressed, you may disrupt the expected experience of others and subsequently be unwelcome. So if you notice or feel like some participants are invited to be themselves, while others are encouraged to censor and compartmentalize aspects of who they are, their identity, your culture, your cares and concerns for the greater good of the collective experience, then you may in fact be in a racially inequitable mindfulness community. So why would this be inequitable, you may ask? Well, it's inequitable because some racialized experiences are centered in privileges while others are marginalized. So recognizing such inequities can be particularly disorienting in a mind-body intervention due to the vulnerability that comes with the invitation to be open and aware, but yet to not be aware of those things. And, you know, not be aware of that. And you can ask, well, what is the that? For some, the that is who you are. So in my case, my identification as a Black person and my recognition that maybe no one in this space looks like me, my understanding that the practices are not necessarily novel, and in fact, the practices may feel quite familiar, but has been demonstrated in a more communal, more physical, and possibly even louder way. You know, or my understanding that the reasons for my implementation of these practices may not just be for internal stressors that may require a change in attitude, but that the stressor may be caused by something that I cannot change, nor want to change about myself, which could be the negative perceptions and differential treatment from others that I may receive due to my race or biases about my culture. So in short, I am referring to the dehumanizing experience of the social stressor of racism. Again, what if the space is not allocated for all of these observations that I just mentioned, all of the things that could be going on in my mind? What if this space is not allocated for these observations and recognitions tied to one's culture? What happens is, in really a highly isolated experience that can further exacerbate the concerns that you entered this community to relieve. In fact, research has shown that Black participants have reported hesitancies to engaging in culturally non-adapted mindfulness strategies due to concerns of being stigmatized. Black women scholars specifically have highlighted the absence of cultural considerations and lack of cultural congruence among existing mindfulness-based initiatives for the daily race-related stressors experienced by communities of color. These scholars include Searle Woods-Gascombe, Natalie Watson-Singleton, and Northwestern's very own Inger Burnett-Ziegler. So, you know, but these mind-body interventions, they don't need to feel this way. They don't need to feel like they're, you know, isolated experiences in which we can't show up or feel like we have permission to question or wonder about things that are deeply related to our identities or the stressors that are linked to those identities. You know, these interventions and classes can be designed and facilitated in a manner that is culturally responsive. It can be facilitated in a manner that invites the dynamic, vibrant, and sobering expression of one's culturally informed observations and experiences. A holistic, socially conscious, and liberatory co-creation of a mindfulness community is possible. And we just have to really think about how we want to intentionally design and facilitate such a community. So I'm just curious about who is interested in facilitating such a community that could feel responsive and dynamic and really addressing the needs of the individuals in the space. So I'm going to raise my hand. Like I want to know more for sure. And of course, we're in the right space to be intentional about creating more inclusive and culturally responsive, contemplative or mind-body interventions. So let's go back. I'm going to go back one slide to just talk about what it looks like to be a culturally responsive teacher. So Villegas and Lucas in their 2002 article, they indicated that there are the multiple levels of awareness that were necessary for teachers to be culturally responsive. This includes sociocultural awareness, or you can think of that meaning the factors that influence one's personal biases. You want to be aware of the people in your classroom's backgrounds as well as their strengths. But you're also at the same time being aware of how you can use this learning environment to build from the student's strengths. And on top of that, you're thinking about your commitment to act as an agent of change. So these are all of the things that culturally responsive teachers are keeping at the top of mind as they facilitate or instruct a course. And now I'd like us to take a moment to just imagine what being in a space with this type of instructor would look like. What would it feel like? And even if this feels familiar, if you can identify a teaching or learning experience in which the instructor was able to hold these various forms of awareness in a container for the benefit of all of those in the space. So just give you a moment to both imagine and reflect about what receiving instruction from this type of facilitator could feel like or has felt like. All right, thank you. So now let's get down to how we can address racial inequality through a culturally responsive lens. So we're aware of the things that a culturally responsive is aware of, both in the moment as well as when they're creating the design for their intervention or for their course. And now we're going to kind of list what I think are 3 culturally responsive tips, particularly for those who are designing and facilitating mind-body interventions. So the first tip is to increase your intrapersonal cultural awareness. Okay, what does that look like? What does that mean? So the beginning of this is the idea of recognizing that you, yes, you are a cultural being. You are a cultural being, okay? And even to kind of say this, it is a fact. White people have culture. You are, like, all of us are cultural beings. So that's the first step. How can you unpack or kind of think about, well, what is my culture? Like, how have my different experiences socialized to who I am? And the reason why we consider ourselves to be cultural beings is that we've all gone through a socialization process that has suggested how you should behave, what you should value as members of a particular community, and subsequently your worldviews. So if you could take a moment to really think about, what are some of the rituals or activities that you routinely engaged in as a child with your family, with your neighbors, with your classmates? And then as we're thinking about those rituals or activities, reflect on, what might have been the underlying message of that activity. So with the ask to increase your intrapersonal awareness, it's really to see if we can take some time to reflect and unpack all of the experiences and the ways that you have been taught to behave as a member of your various social groups, particularly your racial and ethnic group. So this is also an ask to be aware of how social group memberships are shaped by historical, political, and social practices that impact individual opportunities. These categories also represent one's social location in relation to privilege and oppression. So increasing your interpersonal cultural awareness is an especially important step because it suggests that the first step to transformation starts with your own self-awareness, not an attempt to try and understand or change someone else. This tip also suggests that in order to respect the differences in others, we must recognize that that the way you do things is not the status quo or the bar of comparison, but that this approach is in fact unique and different. And this is how practices and behaviors that sometimes privilege whiteness or white supremacy can be checked, and how it can be interrupted by us reminding ourselves that the way we've learned something or the approach that we've taken is not the only way. It is not the default. It is simply a way. And in fact, a way that is different from other individuals. Okay, so now to our second tip, to challenge the assumptions of universality. So two of the chapters of our contributors, Doctors Natalie Watson-Singleton of Spelman College and Angela Rose Black of Mindfulness for the People, their chapters, they wrote about mindfulness and compassion-based interventions, and they noted how they have mainly emphasized the commonalities and universalities of human experiences. One example of this is to emphasize the universality of suffering. Now, this approach can be problematic because, one, it's ahistoric and it's acontextual to say that suffering is equally distributed across all groups. The truth is that these experiences exist because of hierarchies that unfairly benefit some and unjustly disadvantage others. When these truths are not acknowledged, it can feel like you are being gaslit, and leading you to question your observations, experiences, and historical facts that you know to be true. So given the different challenges that exist across groups, accentuating suffering's universality and mind-body interventions may lead people of color to feel invisible and invalidated during the session or during the intervention. So what can you do to challenge the assumptions of universality? Well, one, you can really think about using facilitators from BIPOC communities, and BIPOC, of course, standing for Black, Indigenous, or people of color. So really being intentional about who you are asking to facilitate these spaces. And even that might even mean to be intentional about training community members to disseminate these mind-body practices. Another way to challenge these assumptions of universality is to incorporate cultural values from these communities, but also talking about these values within a particular context. I think that could be helpful, as well as highlighting the perceived benefits of mind-body intervention. So talking about how this can assist with perceptions of stress or of different mental health outcomes. It's okay to be explicit about how an intervention like this could aid them and aid individuals in their day-to-day activities, as well as how they view themselves and others. Like, it's okay to be explicit in the perceived benefits. Okay. And now we're going to move on to the third tip, which is to acknowledge the existing mindfulness communities within the BIPOC communities, within these Black, Indigenous, and people of color spaces. So this culturally responsive consideration actually served as one of the main motivations for my colleagues and I to propose the premise of our book, Beyond White Mindfulness. We recognized that some mindfulness practices were being repackaged as novel, and there was a perception that mindfulness should be brought to communities of color. But this perspective is not only rooted in the problematic white savior complex, but ignores the fact that BIPOC communities are rich with existing cultural traditions of stillness and awareness of practices that are deeply significant to their well-being. So the idea of like bringing something that isn't there is just ill-informed, okay? Angela Rose Black and Sue Switzer's chapter in the book noted that these facts can be missed when viewing mindfulness practices through a white racial frame. So what can we do? What can mind-body intervention designers do to acknowledge the existing mindfulness cultures? Well, one, they can really be open to draw comparisons to between the attitudes of mindfulness and religious or spiritual practices that are often deeply entrenched in one's culture. So you should also address any religious concerns, noting that the practices of spirituality we want you to note or acknowledge, yes, that the practices are spiritual, but that this is not a religious intervention. And by noting that the practices are spiritual, that's more so kind of acknowledging where the practices of yoga and meditation originally came from. Like they were linked to spirituality and the spirituality of people of color. And so you can also note that mindful awareness is a practical skill that can enhance one's spirituality in the moment as life is happening. So we do find that it's important with individuals of color to acknowledge spirituality in some of the mindfulness practices, but also that it's not a religious intervention, but that that they might see commonalities between their religion, their spiritual practices, and the things that you're teaching them in the course, and that is okay. Another tip or way that you can acknowledge existing mindfulness cultures is to read about and learn more about the intention of culturally informed rituals and practices. You may find that the intention behind these activities are linked to some of the attitudes that are also centered in mindfulness-based interventions. So taking some time to really get an understanding of what the intentions of culturally informed rituals and practices are, because there could be a level of overlap. And another thing that I recommend is getting comfortable citing where certain practices came from that may be utilized within a mind-body intervention, and also providing multiple examples, including examples that are communal and nature-based. This will help the participants see themselves in the activities and increase perceptions of familiarity, relevance, and subsequent engagement. This strategy also embraces a constructivist view of learning in which learners use their prior knowledge and beliefs to make sense of new ideas. So these considerations are not only culturally responsive, but strength-based, modeling inclusive teaching pedagogies. So as we at least wrap up the more didactic part of today's session, I'd like us to take a few moments to reflect on these 3 prompts. And now, after stating them out loud, I'll pause for about just 3 minutes. And one, I'd like us to think of one way that you could make your interactions more culturally responsive. And then think about a hesitancy that you may have around applying that that practice. So what might be a reason for you not to actually engage with or implement this practice? And it's okay to be honest with yourself. And then if we could think of one way that you can move beyond that hesitancy or barrier and fulfill and actually implement the plan of being more culturally responsive. So I'm gonna be quiet for about 2 minutes so we can really just kind of see what's bubbling up for you after thinking about some of these more culturally responsive ways to engage with mind-body interventions or within interactions in general. So we're gonna pause for a moment or two, and then I'll come back on. If you can begin wrapping up some of your thoughts, at least for now, knowing that you can absolutely return back to thinking. And I encourage you to return back to thinking about ways to incorporate culture and being culturally responsive into your engagements with others. And so before we transition into the Q&A session, I would again like to thank you for listening and being open to learning and being, being open to just your own personal as well as the collective transformation that I think is what the times, what our society, what we need right now. And I'd like to close with a poem by Morgan Harper Nichols. She is an African-American woman poet. And this is the poem. Perhaps this is the season to step fully into the beautiful reality of what it means to be free, brave and adventurous, and ready for the journey of learning and growing, of living and knowing. You do not have to have every answer to breathe deep and keep going. And this is from her book of poetry called All Alone You Were Blooming, Thoughts for Boundless Living. So again, thank you for joining us. If you have it, I want to quickly say, if you have any questions, feel free to email me at veronica.womack@northwestern.edu. but also we'll be on the line for a bit. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Oh, you're muted.
So sorry about that. We have a question in the Q&A, and please, everyone, feel free to add questions to the Q&A. This event is deeply heartening. It is heartening to know the specific expertise of Dr. Womack is valued by Northwestern. It is heartening that she was invited by IFAM and the Osher Center, and it is heartening to imagine Dr. Womack's knowledge disseminated throughout Feinberg through this event. How many of us are in attendance today? Okay, I can go ahead and we can answer that once we finish with the rest of the questions. And then another question is, you mentioned before about people of color not being as welcome or encouraged to express themselves fully in open environments, and therefore they may be in a racist or at very least toxic space. What are some of the specific ways we unconsciously shut people out so that we are aware of how to recognize this and change our actions to create a more welcoming environment?
Ooh, that's good. And so it feels like an opportunity to really talk about some of my knowledge and just being like a social psychologist and thinking about implicit biases. Well, the piece about our implicit attitudes is that we don't, as you said, we don't necessarily know what those attitudes are, but sometimes they show up in these non-verbal ways. So our explicit attitudes, that shows up as like what we say, but then the implicit piece is maybe like how you say what you say. But to give maybe more specific examples, like, are you allowing time for a person to complete their thought, right? Is there maybe a level, are you giving eye contact? Are you expressing a level of interest and curiosity about what the person is saying? So I would kind of think about, are being intentional about having space for people to engage. What are the ways that I'm showing that I am paying attention, that I do want the person to contribute, not just for my own learning, but out of curiosity about them, but for the space for that own individual's need for expression. So I would probably, I think that there are even more ways to think of, well, what could you do to be more to create more inclusive spaces in your behaviors. I think that even is there something that you can say up front about your awareness of your identities, or the lack of other identities in this space? Is there maybe a way of possibly acknowledging something that has happened in a current event, but kind of, I want to make sure that I'm not giving instructions that can feel performative, but it really kind of coming from a space of like, how can I not just feel more empathy towards other experiences, but more care about the experiences of others, and how these experiences are rooted in, can be rooted in both historical and contemporary forms of racism at institutional, systemic, intrapersonal, or even internalized ways.
Thank you so much, Dr. Womack. I think that concludes our session for today. Thank you again for presenting.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
You as well.